Music and festivities echoed downstairs in the White House. But the floor above was a completely different world, silent, lonely, and heavy with the smell of medicine. Letitia Tyler became the First Lady while paralyzed, able only to sit motionless in an armchair and watch life pass by through a narrow window. She was stripped of the ability to walk and speak, just as her husband ascended to the highest peak of power. She had no need for silk gowns, as she spent her entire day confined by the fireplace, holding a needle or peeling potatoes for the family dinner. She was a resilient, disabled woman who suppressed her physical pain to remain a spiritual pillar for her husband, before finally collapsing in that cold room. She became the First Lady to die in the White House, ending a life where she held the title of mistress, but lived more miserably and stagnantly than a commoner. Letitia Christian was born on November 12, 1790. It was a time of immense transition for the young nation. George Washington, a fellow Virginian, had been president for only 1 year. The dust of the Revolution was still settling, but in the Tidewater region of Virginia, the old social orders remained rigidly intact. Letitia was not merely born into a family. She was born into an institution. She was a daughter of the First Families of Virginia, FFV, the American equivalent of royalty. Her cradle was Cedar Grove, a sprawling, prosperous plantation in New Kent County, a place where the Pamunkey River wound its way through fertile fields of tobacco and wheat. Her father was Colonel Robert Christian, a man who cast a long shadow. He was not just a planter, he was a force of nature in the county. A staunch Federalist, he believed in a strong central government, order, and hierarchy. He had served in the Virginia Senate and was a friend to the Founding Fathers. The Christian family name was Currency. It opened doors in Richmond and Williamsburg before Letitia even drew her first breath. To be a Christian was to be practically untouchable in the social strata of the South. Her mother was Mary Brown, a woman of equal standing. Together they presided over Cedar Grove like feudal lords. For a child born into this environment, life was determined by a strict code of conduct. The geography of Letitia's childhood was one of lush green landscapes, manicured gardens, and the brutal, unseen machinery of enslaved labor that kept the entire economic system afloat. It is crucial to understand that Letitia was raised in a world of absolute duality. On the surface, Cedar Grove was a place of genteel hospitality, where tea was served in imported silver and politics were discussed in hushed tones in the parlor. But underneath, it was a business. The wealth of the Christians, and indeed the future dowry of Letitia herself, was built on the backs of the enslaved workforce that tilled the fields. Letitia grew up watching her father command this empire, absorbing lessons on authority and management that would later define her marriage. She was the seventh child, surrounded by siblings. From the moment she could walk, she was aware of her place in the world. She was a girl of the aristocracy, and her destiny was pre-written. She was to be a wife, a mother, and a manager. There were no other options. We often romanticize the 19th century Southern belle as a creature of leisure, a woman in a hoop skirt fainting on a chaise lounge, fanning herself while waiting for a suitor. This is a fiction created by Hollywood. The reality for women like Letitia Christian was far more industrious and demanding. Letitia received almost no formal schooling. While the boys of her class were sent to the College of William and Mary to learn Latin, Greek, philosophy, and law, Letitia was kept at home. She was never taught to debate the merits of the Constitution or to analyze the geography of Europe. By modern standards, her academic education was practically non-existent. She was not book smart in the way her future husband would be. However, to call her uneducated would be a grave mistake. Letitia was enrolled in a rigorous vocational training course designed to produce a deputy husband. From a young age, her mother Mary took her in hand. Letitia was taught the complex logistics of running a massive estate. This was not just about arranging flowers. It was about supply chain management. She learned how to oversee the production of clothing for hundreds of people, family and slaves alike. She learned how to smoke meats in the smokehouse to ensure the family had food through the winter. She learned to inventory linen, silver, and grain. She was taught basic medical care, as the plantation mistress was often the first doctor for the household's ailments. Most importantly, she learned finance. In a society where men often gambled their fortunes on horse races or risky land speculation, the women were often the silent accountants. Letitia developed a sharp mind for numbers and a frugal nature. She understood the value of a dollar in a way that many of her male counterparts, who were used to limitless credit, did not. She grew into a young woman who was described by contemporaries as painfully shy. She did not possess the sparkling, flirtatious wit that was fashionable in Richmond society. She was not the girl who would dance on the table or make a room erupt in laughter. Letitia was quiet. She was the stillness in the center of the turning wheel. She was also deeply, profoundly pious. The Christian family belonged to the Episcopal Church, and for Letitia, faith was not a Sunday habit. It was the lens through which she viewed her existence. Her Bible was her constant companion. This piety gave her a demeanor of utter selflessness. She was trained to put the needs of her father, her brothers, and eventually her husband above her own desires. She was the perfect embodiment of the Victorian ideal, the angel in the house. It was into this quiet, ordered, and wealthy life that John Tyler crashed in 1808. He could not have been more different from the Christians if he had tried. John Tyler was born at Greenway, a nearby plantation, but his family's energy was radically different. His father, Judge John Tyler, was a fiercely anti-British patriot, a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and a man who believed in Republican simplicity rather than Federalist hierarchy. Young John Tyler was 18 years old when he first truly noticed Letitia. He was a law student, thin, with a prominent nose and a shock of unruly hair. He was charming, ambitious, and radiated a kind of chaotic energy. He loved to play the fiddle, he loved to talk, and he loved poetry. He was a romantic in the truest sense of the word, emotional, impulsive, and prone to grand gestures. He met Letitia, who was then 18 as well, at a social gathering in New Kent. The attraction was immediate, but it was likely puzzling to onlookers. Why would the boisterous, fiddle-playing, ambitious John Tyler be drawn to the silent, shy, and incredibly reserved Letitia Christian? Perhaps he sensed that she was exactly what he needed. John was a man of the wind, always moving, always changing direction, always blowing hot and cold. Letitia was the earth, solid, immovable, and fertile. He needed an anchor, and he found it in the quiet girl from Cedar Grove. But if you expect a whirlwind romance, you are looking at the wrong century. The courtship of John Tyler and Letitia Christian was a saga of agonizing propriety. John Tyler fell in love quickly, but the road to the altar was blocked by the social customs of the day and his own lack of funds. He was a second son. He would not inherit the bulk of his father's estate. He had to make his own way as a lawyer before he could respectfully ask Colonel Christian for his daughter's hand. Their courtship lasted 5 long years. It was a relationship conducted in the parlor of Cedar Grove, always under the watchful eyes of chaperones. It was a romance of restraint. They wrote letters, passionate ones on his side, demure ones on hers. John would ride his horse from Greenway to Cedar Grove, dusting off his coat before entering the house, to sit stiffly on a settee and discuss safe topics like the weather or the harvest with Letitia's parents, while stealing glances at Letitia. Years later, John Tyler would confess a detail to his children that perfectly encapsulates the strict morality of their era and the deep, reverent respect he held for Letitia. He admitted that in all those 5 years of courtship, 5 years of longing, of visits, of letters, he only dared to kiss her once. It happened just 3 weeks before their wedding, and it was not a passionate embrace. It was a single kiss on her forehead. That was it. That was the physical extent of their passion before marriage. It seems almost alien to the modern mind, but it speaks to a profound, disciplined devotion. They were not rushing. They were building a foundation. John saw her as a creature of purity, something to be protected and revered, not seized. For Letitia, these 5 years were a test of patience. She watched other young women marry and start families, while she waited for John to establish his law practice. She trusted him. She believed in his brilliance even when he had no money in his pockets. She saw the potential for greatness in the skinny fiddle-playing lawyer. Finally, by 1813, John Tyler had established himself. He had been elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. He was becoming a man of consequence. He formally asked Colonel Christian for permission to marry Letitia. The colonel agreed. It was a good match. The Tylers were a respectable family, and John was clearly a rising star. But more importantly for John, the marriage came with a significant bonus. Letitia was bringing a substantial dowry, land, enslaved people, and cash. For a young man with high ambitions and empty pockets, Letitia was not just a love match, she was a lifeline. On March 29, 1813, on John Tyler's 23rd birthday, they were married at Cedar Grove. It was a modest but elegant affair, typical of the Virginia gentry. Letitia wore a dress of simple elegance, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. John, by contrast, was likely beaming, vibrating with the excitement of finally claiming the woman he had pursued for half a decade. But as the carriage rattled away from Cedar Grove, taking Letitia away from the only home she had ever known, the dynamic of their marriage was already being set in stone. The honeymoon period, if it ever truly existed in the modern sense, was brief. Almost immediately after their marriage, John Tyler's political career ignited. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1816, then became governor of Virginia, and eventually a U.S. Senator. This success came with a heavy price for Letitia: absence. For the next 25 years, John Tyler was a ghost in his own home. He was constantly on the road, traveling the dusty, rutted carriage tracks between their Virginia estate and the humid, swampy capital of Washington City. He spent months at a time living in boarding houses, debating tariffs and states' rights, attending balls, and playing his violin for adoring crowds. He was a man who fed on public affirmation. Back in Virginia, Letitia was left to confront reality. She was not merely waiting for him, she was actively ensuring his survival. John Tyler was a man of expensive tastes and generous, often reckless impulses. He loved fine wine, he loved to entertain, and he had a habit of lending money to friends who never paid him back. He was a brilliant theoretical politician, but a disastrous practical economist. While John debated states' rights and played his violin for adoring crowds, Letitia was left to confront the brutal economic reality. She stood between the family and ruin. Nowhere is this dynamic clearer than in a surviving letter from John to Letitia. He writes to her from Washington not to give orders, but to humbly ask for money. The great statesman, the orator of the Senate, had to write home to his quiet wife to ask if the budget allowed for new clothes or expenses. She controlled the purse strings because he knew he could not be trusted with them. She was also the disciplinarian. While John was the fun father who would swoop in for a few days, play games, and spoil the children, Letitia was the constant presence. She ensured the children were educated, clothed, and, most importantly, pious. She read to them from the Bible every evening. She taught them that their father was a great man doing important work for the nation, crafting a myth of the heroic patriarch even as he was largely absent from their daily lives. She did all this while maintaining a facade of effortless grace. Neighbors described her house as always perfectly kept, her hospitality as warm but dignified. She hid the financial strain. She hid the loneliness. She was the architect of the Tyler family's stability, building a fortress of order that allowed John to play the role of the carefree aristocrat. To understand Letitia's resilience, one must look at the physical toll demanded of her body. Between 1815 and 1830, Letitia gave birth to 8 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. In the 19th century, childbirth was a coin toss with death. Every pregnancy was a potential death sentence. Letitia spent a collective total of nearly 6 years of her life pregnant. Her children were her world: Mary, Robert, John Jr., Letitia, Elizabeth, Anne, Alice, and Tazewell. She was fiercely protective of them. In an era where child mortality was rampant, the fact that 7 of her children reached adulthood is a testament to her vigilance and care. She nursed them through fevers, cholera scares, and the myriad dangers of plantation life. However, the strain of constant childbearing, combined with the immense stress of managing the plantation alone, began to wear her down. By her late 40s, Letitia was no longer the fresh-faced girl from Cedar Grove. She was tired. Her letters from this period, though few, hint at a deep exhaustion. She never complained; her religious stoicism forbade it. But the silence in the house when the children grew up and John was away must have been deafening. She had given everything to the Tyler name. She had poured her youth, her health, and her inheritance into fueling John's career. By 1838, as they approached their silver anniversary, she likely looked forward to a quiet retirement. John had resigned from the Senate in a dispute over principles and had broken with the Democratic Party. His political career seemed to be winding down. They planned to retreat to their home in Williamsburg. Letitia imagined a future of sitting by the fire, knitting, and finally having her husband to herself. But fate was not done with Letitia Tyler. The catastrophe struck in the winter of 1839. Letitia was 48 years old. Without warning, a massive stroke, then called apoplexy or paralysis, seized her. It was a devastating event. When she regained consciousness, the damage was permanent. Her right side was completely paralyzed. Her right arm, once so busy with ledger books and cradling infants, hung useless at her side. Her right leg would no longer bear weight. She could not walk. In an instant, the active managing deputy husband was rendered an invalid. The psychological impact must have been shattering. For a woman who defined her worth by her usefulness, by her ability to serve God and her family through labor, this could have been the end of her spirit. In many 19th century narratives, this is where the woman fades away, becoming a burden hidden in a back room. But Letitia Christian Tyler did not fade. Remarkably, her mind remained untouched. Her speech was slightly impaired but quickly recovered. Her intelligence, her sharp financial acumen, and her deep religious faith were intact. She refused to be sidelined. She adapted with a grim determination. She could no longer roam the plantation, so she moved her command center to her armchair. She had a small table placed next to her chair of ease. On it sat her Bible, her prayer book, and her knitting needles. She taught herself to knit using only her left hand, a feat of dexterity and patience that astounded her family. She continued to direct the household staff. She still approved the menus. She still reviewed the accounts, having the books brought to her lap. She was no longer the physical engine of the house, but she remained its brain. John Tyler was deeply affected by her illness. By all accounts, he was tender and attentive during this time. He wrote poetry for her. He sat by her side and read to her. For a brief moment, it seemed that his political ambition had been curbed by her tragedy. He seemed content to care for his old lady, as he affectionately called her. But the quiet life was a mirage. The outside world was about to crash through the doors of their Williamsburg home. In 1840, the Whig Party was looking for a ticket to defeat the incumbent President Martin Van Buren. They chose an aging war hero, William Henry Harrison, as their nominee. For vice president, they needed a Southerner to balance the ticket. They needed someone who could bring in the states' rights vote. They chose John Tyler. The campaign of 1840 was a circus, the first modern political campaign. It was the log cabin and hard cider campaign. The slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," was chanted in streets across America. There were parades, songs, and massive rallies. From her wheelchair in Virginia, Letitia watched this madness unfold. She must have felt a deep sense of dread. She knew her husband. She knew that the lure of the spotlight was irresistible to him. Even though the vice presidency was seen as a largely ceremonial, do-nothing job, it meant he would be pulled back into the orbit of Washington. John accepted the nomination. He campaigned vigorously. And in November 1840, the Whigs won in a landslide. Letitia was now the second lady of the United States. However, the plan was simple. The vice president had few official duties. John would travel to Washington for the inauguration and occasional Senate votes, but he would largely remain in Virginia. Letitia would not have to move. She could stay in her safe, adapted environment, surrounded by her familiar comforts. This was the compromise. She would let him have his glory, and she would keep her peace. William Henry Harrison was inaugurated on March 4th, 1841. It was a cold, wet day. Harrison, 68 years old, gave the longest inaugural address in history, nearly 2 hours, without a coat or hat. John Tyler attended the ceremony, took his oath as vice president, and then promptly returned to Virginia. He had no intention of lingering in Washington. He went home to Letitia. They settled in, expecting 4 years of quiet prestige. But Harrison had caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia. On the night of April 4th, 1841, just 31 days after taking office, President William Henry Harrison died. It was dawn on April 5th when a messenger from the State Department pounded on the door of the Tyler home in Williamsburg. John Tyler opened the door, likely in his nightshirt. He was handed the letter. The president was dead. The shock was absolute. Nothing like this had ever happened in American history. The Constitution was vague. It said the powers and duties of the office would devolve to the vice president, but it didn't say he became the president. Was he vice president acting as president? Was he merely a placeholder until a new election could be held? John Tyler didn't hesitate. In a move that would define his legacy, he declared that he was not acting. He was the president. He took the oath of office. He moved into the White House, and this decision sealed Letitia's fate. The news that she was now the First Lady of the United States was not a cause for celebration for Letitia Tyler. It was a sentence. She was paralyzed. She was frail. She was deeply shy. The idea of moving to the White House, a drafty, public, cavernous mansion filled with strangers and political sharks, was terrifying. But her sense of duty was absolute. Her husband was the president. Her place was by his side. The journey to Washington in 1841 was a logistical nightmare for an invalid. There were no paved highways, no accessible vehicles. She had to be carefully lifted into a carriage, propped up with pillows to cushion the jolts of the rough roads. The trip took days. When the carriage finally pulled up to the north portico of the White House, Letitia did not walk up the grand steps. She was carried. Servants lifted her chair and bore her through the massive doors, past the gawking staff and directly up the winding staircase to the family quarters on the second floor. She was placed in a large, airy bedroom on the south side of the house, overlooking the Potomac River. This will be my world now, she might have thought. And she was right. For the remaining months of her life, Letitia Tyler would effectively never leave that floor. The White House, the symbol of American power, became her prison and her sanctuary. With her arduous journey from Virginia complete, Letitia was physically installed in the White House, yet she remained a world apart from it. The heavy doors of the executive mansion closed behind her, shutting out the curious crowds, but they could not shut out the political hurricane raging around her husband. As the accidental president prepared to do battle in the offices downstairs, Letitia retreated to the upper chambers. The stage was now set for a presidency of two distinct worlds, the chaotic, venomous arena of the ground floor and the hushed, lavender-scented sanctuary above, where the true heart of the administration would soon begin to beat. By the spring of 1841, the White House was a house divided, not by war, but by atmosphere. The ground floor was a battlefield. The executive mansion was open to the public in a way that is unimaginable today. Office seekers, lobbyists, curious tourists, and angry Whigs wandered through the halls, tracking mud on the carpets and spitting tobacco juice into the spittoons. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of desperate men. President John Tyler sat in his office, besieged. He had vetoed the bank bill, a central tenet of the Whig Party platform, arguing it was unconstitutional. The reaction was volcanic. His entire cabinet, except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned in protest on a single Saturday in September 1841. It was a mass exodus designed to humiliate him and force his resignation. Outside the gates, mobs gathered, shouting "Resign" and burning effigies of the president. He received hundreds of letters threatening assassination. But if you climbed the winding staircase to the second floor, the noise of the mob faded away. The air became cooler, scented with lavender and dried rose petals. This was Letitia's domain. Her bedroom became the emotional anchor of the administration. It was furnished simply, with her favorite chair positioned near the window to catch the light for her needlepoint. Here, the accidental president was not a usurper or a traitor. He was simply John. Every evening, after the last secretary had left and the gas lamps were dimmed downstairs, John Tyler would climb those stairs. He would enter Letitia's room, often exhausted and trembling with rage at the insults hurled at him by Henry Clay in the Senate. We have no transcripts of their conversations, but the evidence of her influence is in his survival. John Tyler was a man of volatile temper and deep insecurity. Without a stabilizing force, he might have lashed out rashly or collapsed under the pressure. Letitia provided that stability. She listened. She offered the perspective of the Old South, a reminder of duty, dignity, and the long view of history. She was the calm in the eye of the hurricane. While the newspapers called him His Excellency, she treated him with the reverence due a head of state, reinforcing his own belief in his legitimacy. She was the only person in Washington who wanted nothing from him but his well-being. Because Letitia was physically unable to perform the public duties of a first lady, a crisis of protocol arose. Who would host the state dinners? Who would pour the tea for the diplomats' wives? Who would stand beside the president? Letitia, with her characteristic pragmatism, solved the problem. She deputized her daughter-in-law, Priscilla Cooper Tyler. Priscilla was the wife of Robert Tyler, the president's eldest son. Her background was shocking to the stiff Washington elite. She was an actress. Before marrying Robert, she had performed on stage to support her bankrupt family. In the 1840s, actresses were considered barely a step above prostitutes in social standing. But Letitia saw past the prejudice. She saw in Priscilla exactly what the Dower Tyler administration needed: charm, wit, beauty, and a thick skin. The relationship between the invalid matriarch and the young, vibrant actress is one of the most touching chapters of the Tyler presidency. It could have been a relationship fraught with jealousy. Letitia could have resented Priscilla for taking her place. Priscilla could have dismissed Letitia as a useless relic. Instead, they formed a deep, loving partnership. Priscilla revered Letitia. In her letters to her sisters, Priscilla described Letitia not as a burden, but as a saint. "She is the most entirely unselfish person you can imagine," Priscilla wrote. "Notwithstanding her very bad health, she regulates all the household affairs, and all so quietly that you can't tell when she does it." They developed a routine. Before every major event, Priscilla would go upstairs to Letitia's room. Letitia would inspect Priscilla's gown, perhaps adjusting a ribbon or offering a piece of jewelry from her own collection. She would advise Priscilla on who was coming, which senator's wife needed extra attention, and which diplomat needed to be soothed. Priscilla would then go downstairs and dazzle the guests, playing the role of the official hostess with theatrical flair. But she always made sure the guests knew who the real mistress of the house was. When complimented on the food or the flowers, Priscilla would demur, "It is all Mother Tyler's doing." This arrangement saved the social face of the administration. Priscilla's parties were legendary, lively, fun, and devoid of the stiff pretension of previous administrations. But the budget, the menu, and the approval came from the woman in the chair upstairs. For nearly a year, Letitia Tyler remained a rumor. The Washington elite whispered that she was dead or mad, or so disfigured that the president hid her away. Then came the wedding. In January 1842, the Tyler's daughter, Elizabeth, was to marry William Waller. It was to be the social event of the season, a White House wedding. The East Room was decked out in garlands of flowers. The gas chandeliers were polished to a blinding shine. Every important person in Washington was invited, from the cabinet members to the foreign ambassadors. Letitia announced that she would attend. The family tried to dissuade her. The exertion would be immense. The crowds would be overwhelming. But the iron backbone of the Christian family revealed itself. This was her daughter's wedding. She would not miss it. The logistics of her appearance were handled with military precision. Hours before the guests arrived, Letitia was dressed in her finest silk gown. Her hair was arranged in a soft lace cap. Then, her strong sons, Robert and John Jr., lifted her chair and carried her down the grand staircase. They placed her in a seated position in the East Room, slightly apart from the main flow of traffic, but clearly visible. When the doors opened and the hundreds of guests poured in, a hush fell over the room as they spotted her. There she sat, the invisible First Lady. She did not look like a monster or a mad woman. She looked like a queen in exile. Her face was pale, ravaged by illness, but her eyes were bright and intelligent. She sat with perfect posture, her good hand resting gently on the arm of the chair. Throughout the ceremony and the reception that followed, she held court. She could not stand to greet the guests, so the guests came to her. The ambassadors bowed low. The cynical senators softened their voices. Witness accounts from that night describe a scene of profound respect. Even the president's harshest enemy seemed moved by the sight of his frail, dignified wife. She spoke little, her voice soft and slightly slurred from the stroke, but her smile was warm. She watched her daughter take her vows. She accepted the congratulations of the world. And then as soon as the formal ceremony concluded and the music for the dancing began, she signaled to her sons. Before the party could turn rowdy, before her stamina failed, she was lifted up and carried back to the silence of the second floor. It was her only public act as First Lady. It was a moment of supreme willpower, a mother forcing her broken body to perform one last duty for her child. The wedding was the high water mark. After January 1842, Letitia's health began a slow, inexorable decline. The Washington summer of 1842 was brutal. The city was built on a swamp. The heat was wet and suffocating. The air buzzed with mosquitoes carrying malaria and bilious fever. The White House, with its poor ventilation and proximity to the stagnant obsession of the canal, was a death trap for the sick. Most of the political class fled the city for the cooler hills or the coast. But the president could not leave. The political crisis was too acute, and Letitia would not leave him. She spent the summer confined to her room. The heat made her lethargic. Her appetite vanished. The paralysis seemed to weigh heavier on her limbs. The family sensed that the end was approaching. Priscilla Cooper Tyler wrote with heartbreaking candor about these months. She described a woman who was fading. There was no dramatic agony, no screaming, just a slow dimming of the light. Letitia spent her days in prayer. She seemed to be detaching herself from the world of politics and ambition, turning her eyes towards something else. John Tyler was frantic with worry. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against the Congress that wanted to impeach him and against the death that was stalking his wife. He spent every spare moment by her bedside, holding her hand, reading the Bible to her. In early September, the weather turned slightly cooler, offering a glimmer of hope, but it was a false dawn. On the evening of September 9, 1842, Letitia suffered a second stroke. This one was different. It was massive and catastrophic. She fell into a coma almost immediately. The doctors were summoned, though in 1842, their toolkit consisted mostly of bleeding and blistering, tortures that likely only hastened the end. The family gathered. The sanctuary on the second floor became a death chamber. Priscilla, Robert, the president, and the younger children stood vigil. They watched the slow, ragged rise and fall of her chest, the sounds of the bustling city outside, the carriages, the shouts of the newsboys, were muffled by the heavy velvet drapes. There is a detail about her final moments that has passed into legend, a detail so poetic it feels scripted, yet it is corroborated by family history. As she lay dying, her hand, her functioning left hand, was unclenched. Someone, perhaps Priscilla or one of her daughters, placed a single fresh damask rose in her hand. It was a symbol of Cedar Grove. It was a symbol of the garden she had tended before politics stole her husband. It was a piece of the earth grounding her as her spirit prepared to fly. She died on the evening of September 10th, 1842. She was 51 years old. The news spread through Washington the next morning. For a brief moment, the vitriol of the political press ceased. The newspapers, which had spent months tearing John Tyler apart, published black-bordered tributes to the virtuous and pious Mrs. Tyler. The bells of the city churches tolled. She was the first wife of a sitting president to die. It was a grim historical precedent. Her funeral was held in the East Room, the same room where she had watched her daughter marry just 8 months prior. It was a solemn Episcopal service. Then her coffin was loaded onto a train beginning the long journey back to Virginia. She was returning to Cedar Grove. She was going home to the red clay, to her parents, to the place where she was once a girl who knew nothing of vetoes, cabinets, or the crushing weight of the presidency. The invisible First Lady had vanished for the last time. The dropping of the rose from her lifeless hand signaled the end of Letitia's suffering, but it also signaled the breaking of the Tyler family's anchor. The silence that fell over the second floor was not peaceful. It was ominous. With the invisible First Lady gone, the protective barrier between John Tyler and his own worst impulses had vanished. As the undertakers prepared the East Room for a state funeral, the grieving children and the distraught president faced a terrifying void. They were about to discover just how essential that quiet woman in the chair had been, now that the machinery of their lives was left to run without its governor. The funeral of Letitia Christian Tyler was a moment of jarring dissonance. In Washington, she had been the invisible First Lady, a rumor living on the second floor. But in death, she was suddenly starkly visible. Her body lay in state in the East Room of the White House, the same room that had witnessed the festive, nervous energy of her daughter's wedding just months before was now draped in black crepe. The mirrors were covered. The gas lights were dimmed to a ghostly flicker. Thousands of people filed past the open casket. It was a spectacle of curiosity as much as grief. For many Washingtonians, this was the first time they had ever laid eyes on the woman who had ostensibly been their First Lady for a year and a half. They saw a face etched with the lines of chronic pain, yet serene in repose. The saintly expression that Priscilla Cooper Tyler had written about was frozen in place, but Washington was not her home. It was her cage. On Monday, September 12, 1842, the final journey began. A solemn procession escorted the coffin to the railway station. President John Tyler, looking haggard and visibly aged, rode in the lead carriage. His grief was genuine and profound. He had lost his compass. For 30 years, Letitia had been the one constant in his chaotic life, the one person who did not care about his polls, his vetoes, or his enemies. The train carried them away from the swampy heat of the capital, back toward the red clay of Virginia. They did not take her to Greenway, the Tyler family estate. Instead, they took her back to Cedar Grove, her birth home. There is a deep symbolism in this choice. Letitia was a Christian before she was a Tyler. In the end, she returned to the soil of her father, Colonel Robert Christian. She was buried in the family plot, surrounded by the ancestors who had taught her the rigid code of duty and management that defined her life. As the earth was shoveled over her coffin, the Tyler family stood united for the last time. The children, Robert, John Jr., Elizabeth, Alice, Tazewell, wept openly. They knew, perhaps better than their father, what had truly been lost. They hadn't just lost a mother, they had lost the gravitational center of their solar system. Without her, the centrifugal force of John Tyler's ambition and eccentricity would threaten to fling them all into the void. The president returned to Washington a broken man. The White House, always a lonely place for him, now felt like a tomb. Without Letitia's quiet presence on the second floor, the dynamic of the executive mansion collapsed. Priscilla Cooper Tyler, the daughter-in-law who had served as the proxy hostess, tried to maintain order, but the heart had gone out of the operation. Priscilla wrote of the gloom that settled over the house. The evening ritual of the president going upstairs to unburden himself to his wife was gone. There was no one to listen, no one to offer the calm, pious advice that tempered his rash impulses. John Tyler became more erratic politically. He was a man on an island. The Whigs hated him. The Democrats didn't trust him. He was the man without a party. And now he was the man without a wife. The winter of 1842 to 1843 was a winter of discontent. The president suffered from bouts of depression. He wrote to friends of his loneliness. The White House went into a period of official mourning. No balls, no music, no grand dinners. The social silence mirrored the political stalemate. During this time, the fissure between the Tyler children and their father began to form. The children were fiercely loyal to their mother's memory. They viewed her suffering as a martyrdom for their father's career. They expected him to spend the rest of his term and perhaps the rest of his life in mourning, honoring the woman who had sacrificed her health for his success. They forgot that John Tyler was not a man of solitude. He was a creature of the social world. He needed adoration. He needed noise. He needed a reflection in someone else's eyes to feel real. And the silence of the widower's life was deafening him. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so did John Tyler. Into this grim, silent atmosphere burst a comet. Her name was Julia Gardner. If Letitia Christian was the embodiment of the 18th century agrarian ideal, pious, rural, productive, modest, Julia Gardner was the shock of the modern 19th century. She was 22 years old, younger than 3 of Letitia's children. She was wealthy, born to a prominent family on Gardiner's Island, New York. She was a city girl, a socialite, and a trendsetter. Julia was everything Letitia was not. She was loud. She was flirtatious. She had been educated in Europe. She had once caused a minor scandal by posing for a department store advertisement, a shocking breach of upper-class protocol that had earned her the nickname the Rose of Long Island. John Tyler pursued the young Julia Gardner with a desperate, almost embarrassing intensity, proposing twice only to be rejected. But history often pivots on sudden tragedies. On February 28, 1844, a horrific explosion aboard the USS Princeton killed Julia's father instantly. In the chaos of smoke and blood, the president didn't just act as a statesman, he became her personal protector. He carried the fainting Julia off the ship, whispering comforts into her ear. The tragedy shattered her resistance. The grieving daughter needed a father figure, and John Tyler was more than willing to fill that void. The memory of Letitia's quiet piety seemed to belong to a different century. The path was now cleared for a new, scandalous dynasty. The spring of 1844 was a season of strange, feverish energy in Washington. The mourning black that had draped the Capitol for the victims of the USS Princeton explosion was slowly being put away, but the gossip was hotter than ever. President John Tyler was 54 years old. Julia Gardner was 24. In the wake of the explosion that killed her father, Julia had become dependent on the president for emotional support. He was her protector. She was his grieving angel. The romance that had been a whispered scandal before the tragedy was now solidified by shared trauma. However, the optics were terrible. The president was still technically in the mourning period for his first wife, Letitia, according to the strict social codes of the Virginia gentry. Furthermore, Julia was in deep mourning for her father. For them to marry so soon, less than 2 years after Letitia's death and only 4 months after David Gardner's death, would be seen as a breach of decency. But John Tyler, the man who had seized the presidency when others said he shouldn't, was not a man to wait. On June 26, 1844, a secret wedding took place. It was not held in Washington, where prying eyes would see, but in New York City, at the Church of the Ascension. It was a clandestine operation. Even the president's own children were not informed until the last possible moment. When the news broke, the shock wave was immediate. The American public was stunned. The Whig newspapers, already hostile to Tyler, had a field day mocking the May-December romance. But the cruelest blow fell on the Tyler children. Imagine the position of Robert, John Jr., and Elizabeth. They were grown adults, some older than their new stepmother. They had spent the last 2 years grieving their mother, Letitia, the woman who had been the moral and structural center of their lives. Now, their father was bringing home a wealthy, flamboyant socialite who was younger than they were, expecting them to call her mother. It was the definitive end of the Cedar Grove era. The pious, quiet, manageable world Letitia had built was shattered. The Tyler II administration was about to get a makeover that would render it unrecognizable. When Julia Gardner Tyler returned to the White House as the new First Lady in the summer of 1844, she didn't just walk through the door, she made an entrance. If Letitia was the invisible First Lady, Julia was the imperial First Lady. Julia loved the spotlight with a hunger that matched her husband's. She found the White House, which Letitia had treated as a solemn duty, to be a stage, and she intended to be the star. She immediately began to overhaul the social operations of the executive mansion. Where Letitia had managed from a shadowed corner with a Bible on her lap, Julia managed from the center of the ballroom with a fan in her hand. She introduced a level of pomp and circumstance that America had never seen before. She began receiving guests while seated on a raised platform, a dais, surrounded by 12 maids of honor dressed in matching white gowns. It looked less like a Republican reception and more like a royal court at Versailles. She hired a press agent, a concept unheard of for a First Lady, to ensure that the newspapers covered her parties, her dresses, and her charm, and most famously, she instructed the Marine Band to play a specific tune whenever the president entered a room to announce his arrival with proper gravity. The song was Hail to the Chief. We still use it today. It was Julia's invention, a piece of theater designed to elevate her husband. For the staff of the White House, the transition must have been dizzying. They had gone from the hush of the sick room, where they tiptoed so as not to disturb the invalid Mrs. Tyler, to the raucous, glittering, waltzing world of the young Mrs. Tyler. Letitia's presence was scrubbed from the walls. Her knitting chair was moved aside. The smell of lavender and medicine was replaced by expensive French perfumes. The Old South matriarchy was gone. The New York aristocracy had arrived. The casualty of this regime change was Priscilla Cooper Tyler. For 3 years, Priscilla had been the deputy First Lady. She had been the one Letitia trusted. She had been the one who nursed Letitia, who organized the parties under Letitia's guidance, and who had held the family together after Letitia's death. Priscilla had loved Letitia deeply. She revered the memory of the woman who had welcomed a penniless actress into the first families of Virginia. When Julia arrived, Priscilla's position became untenable. Julia was the undisputed mistress of the house. There was no room for a daughter-in-law who remembered how things used to be. The dynamic between the 24-year-old stepmother and the 28-year-old stepdaughter-in-law was frosty at best. Priscilla and her husband Robert Tyler packed their bags. They left the White House. Their departure was a quiet tragedy. It marked the final breaking of the circle Letitia had forged. Priscilla had been the bridge between the invalid mother and the outside world. With her gone, the memory of Letitia's reign, the reign of quiet dignity, needlepoint, and financial prudence, left the building with her. The White House was now entirely Julia's, and she played her part to perfection, charming the very congressman who hated her husband, dazzling foreign dignitaries, and writing letters home about how much the people adored her. She was the first celebrity First Lady. In the glare of her brightness, the shadow of Letitia Christian Tyler didn't just fade, it vanished. In March 1845, John Tyler's term ended. He was not renominated. He and Julia left Washington to retire to Virginia, but they did not go back to Cedar Grove, Letitia's birthplace. Nor did they go to Greenway, the old Tyler home. John Tyler bought a new plantation. He named it Sherwood Forest, a cheeky reference to his status as a political outlaw, like Robin Hood. Sherwood Forest was a massive estate on the James River. It was here that John and Julia built their life together. They had 7 children of their own. a second family that would grow up hearing stories of the glorious President's Lady, Julia. Letitia's children, the first 7, were now adults with their own lives, but they felt a growing distance from their father. He was consumed by his young family. The older children drifted away, carrying with them the memory of their mother as a private relic, something holy but irrelevant to the new dynasty being built at Sherwood Forest. At Sherwood Forest, Julia decorated the walls with portraits of herself. She kept court. She relived her glory days in the White House. There were no portraits of Letitia in the main halls. Letitia's grave at Cedar Grove lay miles away, quiet and unvisited by the new mistress of the Tyler clan. The plantation Letitia had managed, the accounts she had balanced, the clothes she had sewn, all of it was part of a past that John Tyler seemed eager to bury. He had reinvented himself. He was no longer the struggling lawyer, married to the pious, paralyzed manager. He was the virile, wealthy patriarch, married to the Rose of Long Island. As the Tyler family reinvented itself amidst the feudal splendor of Sherwood Forest, scrubbing the halls clean of Letitia's image, history was quietly preparing a reckoning. John Tyler may have succeeded in burying the past beneath the glamour of his new marriage, but he could not bury the values Letitia had instilled in their children. The first 7 had grown up absorbing her loyalty to the Virginia soil and her rigid sense of duty. As the clouds of the Civil War gathered on the horizon, these dormant seeds were about to sprout. The conflict would prove that while the father had moved on to a new life, the spirit of the first mother was waiting in the shadows, ready to guide her sons toward a tragic and treasonous destiny. As the 1850s progressed, the United States barreled toward its inevitable fracture. The compromise that John Tyler had spent his career trying to maintain, the delicate balance between Southern slaveholding interests and Northern industrial power, was disintegrating. At Sherwood Forest, the ex-president lived in a kind of feudal splendor with his young wife Julia. They hosted grand parties and raised their new brood of children. But for the children of Letitia Christian, the world was becoming a darker, more dangerous place. They were the inheritors of Letitia's old Virginia values. While Julia Gardner Tyler represented the cosmopolitan, flashy wealth of New York, even though she adopted Southern sympathies, Letitia's children were rooted in the soil of the Tidewater. They had been raised by a mother who believed in strict piety, absolute loyalty to one's kin, and the divine right of the social hierarchy. It is a tragic irony that the very values Letitia instilled in her sons, duty and loyalty to Virginia, would lead them to treason against the United States. When the Civil War finally broke out in 1861, the Tyler family did not hesitate. John Tyler, the former President of the United States, shocked the world by voting for Virginia's secession. He became the only U.S. president to be sworn into the Congress of the Confederate States of America. He turned his back on the Constitution he had sworn to protect, choosing his state over his country. But it was Letitia's son, Robert Tyler, who paid the steepest price. Robert, the dutiful son, who had carried his paralyzed mother down the White House stairs, was living in Philadelphia when the war started. He was chased out of the city by a mob. He fled south, leaving behind his home and his fortune, to join the Confederacy. He eventually became the register of the Treasury for the Confederacy. He signed the banknotes that fueled the rebellion, and Priscilla Cooper Tyler, the actress who had been the sparkling proxy hostess for Letitia, found herself in Montgomery, Alabama, the first Confederate capital. The woman who had once charmed Daniel Webster and Charles Dickens in the White House was now wrapping bandages for wounded rebel soldiers, watching the world of the first families burn to the ground. In a sense, the Civil War was the funeral pyre for the world Letitia Christian had been born into. The plantation economy, the rigid social castes, the genteel slavery of Cedar Grove, all of it was being swept away by the armies of the North. John Tyler did not live to see the end of the war. He died in January 1862 in a hotel room in Richmond, Virginia. He was a member of the Confederate House of Representatives at the time. His death created a surreal moment in American history. In Washington, D.C., the government ignored his death. There was no official period of mourning. The flags were not lowered to half-mast. President Abraham Lincoln issued no statement. To the Union, John Tyler was a traitor. He is the only U.S. president in history whose death was not officially recognized by the federal government. But in Richmond, he was given a hero's funeral. And here, the ghost of Letitia made a final silent appearance. John Tyler was buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. He was laid to rest under a monument paid for by the Confederate government. But he was not buried next to Julia, who would live for another 27 years. Nor was he buried at Sherwood Forest. He was buried in the same city where Letitia had spent her early married years, in the heart of the Virginia he had loved more than the Union. The grand financial stability Letitia had so carefully managed for decades was wiped out by the collapse of the Confederate dollar and the emancipation of the enslaved workforce that constituted their wealth. The Tyler family fortune, which Letitia had saved from John's recklessness time and again, was finally consumed by the fire of history. Why, then, should we remember Letitia Christian Tyler? In the vast library of presidential biographies, she is easy to miss. She left no memoirs. She wrote no political manifestos. She is not a feminist icon in the modern sense. She was a woman of her time, a believer in domestic submission and the institution of slavery. But to ignore her is to ignore the reality of how power functioned in the 19th century. Letitia represents the infrastructure of leadership. We often focus on the great men of history, the ones who make the speeches and sign the treaties. We forget the people who balance the ledgers, who raise the children, who create the emotional stability that allows the great man to function. John Tyler was a man of immense instability, political, financial, and emotional. Without Letitia Christian, he likely would never have reached the Senate, let alone the White House. She was the ballast in his ship. It is no coincidence that his presidency spiraled into chaos and eventually treason after her influence was removed. Furthermore, Letitia deserves recognition as a pioneer of disability history in the White House. We often cite Franklin D. Roosevelt as the great example of a president managing a disability. But nearly a century before FDR, Letitia Tyler was managing the role of First Lady while paralyzed. She did not hide in a sanitarium. She lived in the White House. She appeared at a state wedding in a wheelchair or carried in a chair. She continued to run the household operations with one functioning hand. In an era that viewed physical disability as a moral failing or a reason for exclusion, Letitia Tyler occupied the highest home in the land with dignity. She forced the Washington elite to come to her, to bow to a woman who could not stand. That is a form of quiet power that is rarely celebrated, but deeply significant. Today, if you visit Cedar Grove in New Kent County, Virginia, the house where Letitia was born is gone. It burned down years ago. The sprawling plantation fields are now broken up or overgrown, but the family graveyard remains. It is a quiet place, far from the tourist crowds of Washington, D.C. There is no eternal flame here. There are no Secret Service agents guarding the perimeter. Here lies Letitia Christian Tyler. Her tombstone describes her as the wife of John Tyler, President of the United States. Even in death, she is defined by her relationship to him. But the inscription continues. It speaks of her unassuming duties and her religious walk. History has been unkind to the Tylers. John is remembered as a failure and a traitor. Julia is remembered as a social climber. Letitia is barely remembered at all. But if you look closely at the tapestry of the past, you can see the thread she spun. It is a thread of resilience. It is the story of a woman who was dealt a difficult hand, a reckless husband, a body that turned against her, a public life she never wanted, and played it with absolute grace. She was the woman who held the rose in her hand while the world fell apart. She was the silence that allowed the music to be heard. As we walk back out of the graveyard and leave the 19th century behind, we should take a moment to acknowledge the woman in the chair. She reminds us that history is not just made by the people standing at the podium. It is also made by the people sitting in the shadows, knitting the fabric of the nation together, one stitch at a time, until their strength finally gives out. She was Letitia Christian Tyler, and she was enough.